Hello again. We are Chrononauts, JM, Gretchen, and Nate, and we are bringing you this month Amazing Stories, the first American SF pulp magazine. If you'd like to hear some background, please listen to installment 1, where you will hear some of the history of the magazine and Hugo Gernsback and his little empire of publications. Now, though, we're going to talk about Leigh Brackett and her story, No Man's Land in Space. Take it away, Nate.
Leigh Brackett was born on December 7th, 1915, and provided an absolutely fascinating biographical sketch for her appearance in the July 1941 issue of Amazing Stories, where tonight's story, No Man's Land in Space, appears. In addition to the story, we really encourage you to read her bio here, as it definitely shows off her sense of humor and personality.
Yeah.
So we will just briefly summarize.
It's so much fun.
It is.
Yeah.
At an early age, she develops a love for reading and discovers imaginative fiction, which is a much better word than scientific fiction. So maybe that should have been the term that took off.
Yeah, I mean, I think it encompasses a bit of a broader scope, but
Yeah.
yeah.
But she devours the works of Burroughs, Haggard, Balmer and Wiley, and Doyle's unforgettable Maricot Deep, as well as Jules Verne. But in particular, she really enjoyed Burroughs' John Carter series, which we'll cover on here probably at some point, but it seems to be a big influence on a lot of her stories later on. In addition to developing an early interest in reading, she developed an early interest in writing, and wrote a great deal of material when she was in high school, presumably turning some of it into the stories she would sell a little bit later. And sold a lot of stories she did. Beginning in 1940, she had 59 works of short fiction and novellas published in her lifetime, as well as 10 novels, though some of those novels are fix-ups, so there is a bit of overlap here, but it's still a huge amount of material she has under her belt. Most of her stories were done early in her career, as in the mid-1940s she started writing Hollywood screenplays, notably The Big Sleep with William Faulkner, and Rio Bravo, as well as an early draft of The Empire Strikes Back.
Yeah, so she actually looks like she actually did most of the Big Sleep script. According to her, Faulkner was a nice southern gentleman who drank a lot and always wanted to get back to Mississippi. He did not contribute that many pages.
Yeah, I never saw it, but that's what I heard, is that Faulkner was kind of minimally involved in the production. It is unfortunate that she seems most known as a footnote in the Star Wars universe, as the story we read tonight was really good, and I'm certainly looking forward to exploring more of her stuff, of which there is a lot.
Yeah, and
of
even
it.
though Williamson talks about meeting Brackett after she was really involved with this, he met her before, and then he met her later when she was like more involved with the Hollywood stuff, and he said she seemed like she was a part of a different world by then, but even then, she still kept writing space opera stories like well into the 50s.
Oh yeah, she was writing until she died in the 1970s.
Yeah.
It just slowed down her pace and productivity.
It did slow down in terms of there wasn't so much short work, but there were a lot of novels which were in the style still of the stuff she wrote in the 40s, really. Like, she almost came out of the gate with her style intact, which is pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. She was also married to science fiction author Edmund Hamilton, and the two occasionally worked together, and was fairly acclaimed in her lifetime, and I think still is among fans of the genre. Her novel, The Long Tomorrow, was nominated for a Hugo Award the same year as C.L. Moore, who were the first two women to receive a Hugo nomination of any kind. And while she didn't win, she was the recipient of a Retro Hugo in 2020.
Yeah, and I'm thinking we're going to talk about this at the end of the episode, but we're going to start a new thing next month, and I'm thinking of adding The Long Tomorrow to one of my host choice episodes in the future.
Yeah, I mean, certainly is going to be a lot to cover. Brackett.
It's a book about space Mennonites, basically.
Yeah. But the story we're going to be looking at tonight, No Man's Land in Space, was published in the July 1941 issue of Amazing, and was during this early phase of her career. Now, Amazing Stories had gone through quite a bit of changes since we last checked in. Brackett didn't make the cover this time. Instead, we get a scene from Robert Moore Williams' Survivors from 9000 BC, with this, cloaked figure piloting a marine robot thing rising from the ocean.
Wow.
And inside the issue, we see that it's now a Ziff Davis publication. Ziff being the publisher and Davis being the editor, and a few other higher-ups on the board that are credited. Certainly more people involved than when Gernsback was running the show. Ziff Davis acquired the magazine in 1938 and ran it until 1965, the longest stretch of the magazine, when they then sold it to Saul Colin and Arthur Bernhard. We also get credits for the artists this time around, with Paul still around doing the back cover, Stockton Mulford doing the front cover, and 6 different people doing illustrations and cartoons.
Well, it's kind of cool. You got a whole bunch of different styles.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, they definitely seems like they expanded their operations by this time, as they had probably learned from some of their missteps in the past and kind of made it a more professional operation. The illustration for this particular story shows an encounter with a strange creature who we will meet in just a little bit. And in addition to the reader's column, which has expanded to include addresses for pen pals, trading, buying, and selling items, the editor's column returns, and there's also a scientific mysteries column, a science quiz to test your knowledge, and the ads are more varied, this time including ones for false teeth, an automatic pistol, and a probability book to give you the competitive edge in gambling.
Wow. Quite the ads this time.
Yeah, right.
A bit of an improvement on the radio courses and stuff. Well, I don't know. Improvement's a relative term, I guess. But
oh, yeah, well, we still get all that stuff, too, but a lot of wacky stuff appears in some of the more later issues.
A little more diversity there.
It really is, yeah. I mean, you get a lot of strange things.
Yeah.
Miracle cures, medical quackery, vitality pills, that kind of stuff. So for this story tonight in particular, Brackett says in her bio that she hopes she appears more in Amazing, which unfortunately did not happen again until 1963. The publication she most appeared in was Planet Stories.
Yeah, she really seems to have found a home there.
Yeah, she did. And that was where she published the majority of her early work, even though she did publish in a wide range of magazines.
Ray Bradbury also pretty much got his start there in Planet Stories, and the two of them were pretty close, apparently. So
yeah, I think they might have even collaborated.
They did collaborate on one story. I can't remember the name of it. Ray Bradbury kind of wrote a weirdly mopey poem dedicated to her, which can be found in one of her anthologies. It's kind of a weird thing. Apparently, she never got to read it. She died before she could read it. So.
Yeah, she did die kind of young. She died in the 1970s.
Yeah.
Shortly after her husband. It's kind of one of those tragic stories. But this one was great. It's a real gritty space western with all these morally gray characters, and she's really good at building tension between the various characters. Even though it's a little pulpy, it works really well, probably more so than any of the other originals we covered this time around, I think, anyway. It's also surprisingly dark for a story that appears in Amazing, or at least, again, compared to everything else we've read tonight. And this one, I think, maybe more than anything else, I know I said that Williamson feels like a modern science fiction story, but this one, even more so, feels like a modern science fiction story. That someone could take this story and make a movie or a Netflix serial out of this tomorrow and have to make almost no changes to the story whatsoever.
I'm picturing it more like a Blake Seven story.
Yeah, right.
Almost. It has that kind of atmosphere to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it would work for Blake Seven. You could easily see somebody like a Heinlein or a Niven writing something like this. There's just so many parallels with later authors and franchises. Elements from The Expanse you could see working with this.
Yeah.
Just so much of the legacy of modern science fiction that this really does feel reminiscent of.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this would be considered a part of the Golden Age. Actually, by this time, she had written for Astounding, which was being edited by Campbell at this point. And this is like pretty much the apex of his influence on the genre. But This one ended up in Amazing instead, and that's why we're doing it. So, but she had already submitted at least a couple of stories to Astounding, and we talked earlier last time about Campbell perhaps being reluctant to allow women writers into the magazine, according to Leslie Stone. Well, he was very proud about Leigh Brackett and her womanhood. He announced that. He actually made a point of correcting a reader who misgendered her, and he was very like, oh, actually, Leigh Brackett is a woman, and he was very like pointed about it. So, I don't know. Again, I have to question. Maybe he was just being a dick to her, to Stone. I don't know. A weird thing, but...
Yeah.
But yeah, she took the time to write that really nice biographical letter, which was not what you'd normally see. I mean, Leslie Stone wrote one too, but it was way more pedestrian, way more like cozy and domestic, I guess, feeling than Brackett's letter, which was very candid and personal and open and charming, I thought.
Yeah, and it's also presented in a different way. It was in like a about the authors section, which they didn't do in the earlier issues.
But normally when we see that nowadays in like anthologies and stuff, authors do submit little things like that, and the editors just kind of paraphrase them. Like, they don't usually publish what they wrote specifically. Right. They say, hey, this is so-and-so. They live in this place, and they like cats, and Black Sabbath vintage vinyl. You know, they just published what she wrote, and it was like not the kind of thing I expected to see in the magazine. I don't know. It's hard to explain unless you read it, but it's just, there's something about it that's just so personal and nice. Just like, yeah, I'm Leigh Brackett, and I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere.
Yeah, her personality comes through a lot in that letter.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this one. I think this one, it's tied with The Wells for my favorites that we read this section, this month. And we'd been talking earlier about pacing and how that affects the stories. And for several of them, we talked about how that kind of doesn't really work for them. But this one, like, that's what makes this story, is how well it's paced. Like, it gets right into the action.
Yeah, it hits the ground running.
Yeah, and it continues that way. It feels very... It's just done so well, and like you had said, it has, like, such a great way of building tension. Yeah. It's a good story. I really like this one.
Yeah, and I'm definitely very curious to read her later work, because if she wrote this, like, I think she was 25, 26 when she wrote this, and she'd only been publishing stories for a year. So, I mean, again, very early in her career, so it'd be interesting to see how she developed into the 1960s and 1970s later on in her life.
Yeah, I think I'm definitely into doing more, for sure.
Yeah, I'd like to revisit her as well.
Yeah.
So from what I've read of Brackett, she likes writing about these kind of people. Like, most of her characters are, from the stories that I've read, they're tough spacemen who... they don't really have a fixed abode, and they wander around, and like one of her characters, Eric John Stark, he was raised by savages on Mercury. Like, it was kind of like this Jungle Book almost ish scenario where he's half man, half beast kind of thing. And I guess another thing would be, like Edgar Rice Burroughs.
Well, yeah, I think her Stark character in particular was kind of her response to John Carter.
That makes sense. But even a bit of Tarzan, maybe. Like,
yeah, right.
You know, just as a kind of... I think her prose is, and I'm saying this kind of based on a few other things that I've read, mostly a few other short stories. The novel Alpha Centauri or Die, which she wrote in the 50s, and I think one or two of the Eric John Stark ones. I feel like her prose is better than Edgar Rice Burroughs. Like, she's actually a little more skilled, I think, and more... She pulls you in a little better than Burroughs does, even though I really enjoyed Adios Core to an extent, and Princess of Mars, which maybe we'll do at some point, was pretty good. But I think Brackett is a little bit above that, in a way. And she writes about such, like, hardcore characters all the time. Like, they're really macho, but in a cool way.
Yeah, again, very morally gray and dark in tone. So it's kind of an interesting contrast with her biography, which is, like, very bright and chipper and, like, funny. Whereas this is, like, kind of dark and grim. And there's no good guys in this one.
It's very gritty.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and there are no women in this story, but when she does write about women, they're usually kind of, they can be a little bit badass, but they're also kind of alluring and, like, sexy. She does that. Like, she knows her audience, and she knows what they'll like, and, like, she also, I don't know, she loves dogs and hates cats, according to her bio, but she has a cat girl from Ganymede or something like that in The Halfling or one of these stories, and it's like, something Fritz, I can picture Fritz Leiber having liked because he was really into cats. And so sometimes he made sexy cat women in his stories and stuff like that. That was a thing. So
yeah, I guess the cat girl trope has a interesting history, like all these other strange tropes that persist to the modern day.
Yeah. We're going to get into strange tropes, guys. Like, we gotta open ourselves up to that. Sexy space cats and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But there's no sexy space cats in this story, though.
No, there's not.
No.
But we do get some strange creatures, which is pretty cool that she was able to throw that in there. So yeah, getting into the story, Jeffrey Dana is hearing a clamor.
Our second Dana of the episode.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was fun to read this right after Stone and be like, oh, 2 Danas in a row.
And they're very different Danas, that's for
Yes.
sure. But this one is hearing a clamor in the outlaw town of Sark. And Lauren the Venusian seems to indicate that there's been trouble. Dana had lost a number of his men on this asteroid in the past week. The Earth-Venus War seems to be cutting into their proceeds. And a stretcher brings out Thompson the Earthman, his corpse bled dry, just like the
And I
others.
love how this story just like drops you in like that, and like all of a sudden, here's these people on this asteroid. They're kind of hostile seeming for some reason, and some of them are being killed, like just like that. It hits the ground running and never lets up.
Yeah, she doesn't data dump at you with like the background of why they're on this asteroid, who they are,
Yeah.
like the technological world. She just puts
Yeah,
you right in it.
Like when it's something that needs to be explained, it's part of the action. It's like the exposition doesn't just like stop the story to tell you what's going on. It's placed within the actions of the characters, which is it's really good. I mean, especially compared to some of the other stories we've been reading, where it feels like they have to pause the story sometimes to deliver
Explain
the
everything.
exposition.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
we don't mean to pick on Leslie Stone too much, but I mean, Out of the Void is a really bad offender with that. I mean, where it just pretty much pauses the narrative at many, many times to give us this really dull and dry history of...
Check out the radium dishes and the toothpaste.
Yeah.
I just think that I particularly am just doing it just because I read them both side by side, but I do feel a little bad picking on Stone, but it just happened that when I was reading one, I couldn't help thinking of the other since I had just finished it.
Man. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is much more concise as well, right? Like, I read this story all in one go. I actually had to take, I think, Nate, you said the same thing, that I actually took the Out of the Void in small chunks, you know?
Yeah.
Like, basically a little bit every day, but not very much. This one I read in probably less than an hour. Just raced through it. It was so good.
It is on the shorter end of things we've done for this episode. But yeah, very different lengthwise, very different pacing. And I think Brackett is just, in general, a more talented author. So yeah, a stretcher brings out Thompson, the Earthman, and his corpse has been bled dry, just like the others who have been missing from Dana's party. And the Venusians aren't happy about this either. Neither are the Martians. But the asteroid Sark is the only place in the solar system they can all keep safe.
Dana's like the Prince of Space of this yarn, right?
Right.
And all these people, Martians, Earthlings, and Venusians, who would normally be at war right now, are all his band. So he's trying to keep all these different races together and trying to get them to cooperate. And, like, some of them are predisposed not to like one another. So this is why he's making all these stipulations and stuff that sound unreasonable, but he's really just trying to keep his band together, right?
Pretty much, yeah. And Brackett is very much like a show author, not a tell author, where she's not going to give you all the backstory on everybody involved. She might even be ambiguous if the Venusians and the Martians are extraterrestrials or aliens, or if they're just people from different cultures that have evolved over however many years in the future this takes place.
Yeah, it's almost... I'm a little uncertain about that. Like, that she kind of does make it ambiguous in a lot of her stories, but she kind of makes it seem like they're pretty alien, but maybe it's far enough in the future that their alienness has just developed as a result of them being there and having to adapt to being on a different planet.
Yeah, I mean, again, we don't get the backstory for any of these. We're just like on the asteroid Sark, and it's this pirate base, pretty much.
Yeah.
And Dana's our leader.
So this place is quite unpleasant.
Yeah.
By the sound of it.
Yeah. Very harsh in its climate and remote.
And it smells bad.
Yeah.
How does she describe the odor of the place?
I didn't write it down. Not the kind of place you'd want to hang out in and have a leisurely good time, I don't think.
No, not really. But there's a bunch of people that live there. Dana's the awesome space pirate.
Yeah, no, he's the one that founded the asteroid community, and he developed it, and he gave everybody there a place of sanctuary from, I guess, whatever local law enforcement will be pursuing them, because these are People definitely living on the outskirts of polite society. But tensions are growing between these various factions. And Dana says that he's banning all news of the war, as the people of Sark have no nationality and no allegiances. Thompson's body was found out by No Man's Land, and Dana orders searches conducted. The men are armed with poisoned needle guns. And Thompson has a hole in his throat, and he's clean and drained of blood.
Nate, did you hear that the Hawkwind song, Needle Gun, when you were thinking of this?
I didn't actually, but
I did. It's gonna make you run!
Needle guns come up in a lot of other stuff. But Thompson had gone out to No Man's Land to have a duel with Netta, one of the Venusians, who had also disappeared. And the fact that a number of Venusians have disappeared makes this whole thing even stranger and suspicious. The war news has been getting into the asteroid despite Dana's prohibitions, and just serves to inflame tensions between the various factions. An elderly man, Daddy Gibbs, is playing the news on the TV and starts tearing up while Dana is screaming at him to turn it off. And Dana doesn't care about any of this mass destruction going on out in the other regions of the solar system and is really only interested in his bottom line, which is being greatly affected by the war. Daddy says he's lying to himself and that Dana can't really detach himself like he says he can. This makes Dana rage quite a bit, and he eventually gains control of himself. And him and Lauren go out to check No Man's Land, and the climate on Sark is incredibly harsh. So, looking at the spot where Thompson was found, Lauren wonders if it was Jordan Andrews involved at all, who is this business magnate of some kind and has been building this massive refinery named Andrews Chemical Works in No Man's Land. I suppose an asteroid is a good place to build a chemical works refinery.
Well, yeah. And the way she introduced this was kind of weird, but I think I kind of liked it, but it was just kind of like, oh, that's here too? You know, it was sort of this big chemical refinery with all this nasty smoke coming out of it, and like maybe that's part of why the asteroid smells so bad and it's hard to breathe and stuff.
Yeah.
And it was a weird, cool addition to make this like a hellscape. And the thing is, people live there, right? And there's like, he talks about the town that he's built, and he doesn't really talk about it, but we catch little glimpses of it from the way it's described. And the way it's described is really interesting because she doesn't really describe it in a normal way, but it's just like in the way Dana thinks about things and in the way he thinks about his people and what they're going to do. And then there's talk about like things like brothels in the town and stuff like that, and like all these different things that are alluded to that shows that this is a community where pretty rough people live and try to carry on their existence against the authorities, basically, and in hiding.
Yeah, no, a pretty large group of rough people. I mean, the asteroid must be very large physically if we can have this, like, pirate town being quite a ways away from this giant chemical plant. And, I mean, we see the two are affected a little bit later, but, I mean, they have to go a ways out into No Man's Land. I mean, they call it No Man's Land, presumably because it's like this huge, empty, barren wasteland where it's a good spot to set up a chemical plant because you're just going to be dumping all this crap into somewhere where nobody lives. And that's the whole reason why Dana let Andrews build it there undisturbed, as Sark was beyond interplanetary law. And rather than like attacking Andrews and kicking him off the asteroid to make him leave, Dana thinks it's the smarter move to try to let him set up this chemical refinery here on the middle of nowhere and just let his business fail naturally. But Dana thinks that Andrews is not behind the killings, and he thinks it's something else. But all of a sudden they hear needle guns firing, and they see Andrews and 5 men and decide to check it out in stealth mode when an inhuman shape jumps on him out of nowhere.
Wow.
And
the monster.
Yeah, the monster.
Yeah.
So this is who we see in the illustration for this story.
Oh, man. I couldn't picture it at first. I wasn't sure what it was. Like, the way she described it almost made it seem snake-like. But then it turned out to be a giant ape.
Yeah, right.
And like, it was kind of cool, though, like, not being sure at first. Because it almost felt like Dana wasn't sure. And the way she describes it, it's kind of like, I don't know. Maybe it was just me, but I pictured some kind of big snake. Like the way she talked about it wrapping itself around him and stuff like that.
Mm.
And then I kind of realized, oh, wait, it's some kind of ape-like creature.
Yeah, so, I mean, she uses a couple different animal descriptors. I think she calls it cat-like in some places, and that is covered with thick fur.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it really comes at him out of nowhere. And it's strange enough where, in the confusion, it might be difficult to actually ascertain what is attacking
what kind of creature it is.
Yeah, right. And he's not able to really put up any kind of defense at all. He's able to get a few shots off, but it's to no use. And the fiend, whatever it is, some unknown beast, is just like savagely thrashing him around. And Dana thinks he's going to die. And at the last minute, the ground just shifts. And he's saved by the eruption of the ashy geyser, which throws the two of them back, and the monster, whatever it is caught in this toxic chemical eruption volcano.
Yeah.
So Dana lurches back to civilization, if you could call it that, and Daddy Gibbs spots him, announcing his return. And Dana briefly recounts his encounter to him when he sees a Taro-Venetian half-breed named Varno, who has big news that can't be trusted to the code band and had to be delivered by himself in person. And he says that Ferric of Venus, a scientist, has been working on a secret weapon which Venus says will end the war. And Earth has almost got the secret. So Venus sent the scientist into space in a camouflage ship to finish his experiments on some asteroid. And Varno got the intel out of someone from Venusian High Command. And if they could track Ferric down, they could easily ransom him for huge money. Varno knows that he was using a lunar primate in his experiments, but can't see how that would tie into military weaponry, so, I wonder. The mention of a lunar primate triggers a childhood memory of Dana's, seeing it in a zoo when he was a kid, and it could possibly bear some resemblance to the creature that had just attacked him, and may also explain the throat wounds and the blood being drawn from the victims of the men that they find dead. Dana realizes instantly that Ferric is here on Sark, because, it's pretty obvious, and is using his men for food for his creature. And they're not really sure what to do. Should they kill him in revenge, or take him ransom, or what? And it's a tough call, but Lauren seems to have disappeared, and Dana thinks he might be going to warn the Venusian out of national pride. And they've got to find Lauren, and they see an explosion from the chemical plant, which is possibly an accident, but one that could have seismological consequences due to the instability of the asteroid's geological structure. As if the asteroid breaks up, there is no way off except for Varno's two-seater.
Yeah, this was weird. You would think that they would have kept something on the asteroid to get off, considering that this is supposed to be like a pretty cool, powerful, in their way, pirate band and stuff. They have no like ships hidden in the rocks of the asteroid somewhere. I don't know.
Yeah, it seems like poor planning on their part.
It's pretty poor planning, yeah. But this part was really harrowing, like when she started describing the asteroid breaking up and stuff. Like it really felt like, yeah, this is really serious now. Like this place is not stable.
No, not a good situation to be in whatsoever.
No.
Especially when you're separated from the rest of town and in this like desolate asteroid desert. So they decide to take shelter in a nearby house, and they find a trap door where the ape must have come from. And they'll have time to explore later after the earthquake stops, but Daddy's mind isn't on dying, it's on Earth. And Daddy is trying to convince Dana that he's still an Earthman, but he's being very hard-headed about all of this. However, up the trapdoor comes the lunar primate, which charges them at incredible speed, and it crushes Daddy's bones, and his last word is Earth, as the beast flings him around like a rag doll, and the thing retreats back down the trapdoor with Dana in his arms.
This is such a weird creature. Such a weird creature, though, and she does such a good job of being like, this is a creature that's born out of a biology that's you're not familiar with.
Yeah.
And it's an ape, but it, like, has characteristics of other types of animals, and it also has fur that anesthetizes its prey. It's like this overpowering, drugging aroma, but it's also somehow like the texture of it and the softness of it, and it makes people like weak, and they can't resist. They get pulled in and I guess eaten or drained somehow.
Yeah, and again, she handles all this stuff very well in story. Like, she doesn't give you these whole long paragraphs of why this creature behaves the way it does. Like, it just does behave in this way.
Yeah, well, it's an animal, so...
Yeah.
Yeah.
But while the creature has Dana wrapped up in its arms, he assumes that it's heading for the Venusian hideout through some maze of underground tunnels, so he decides to let him be carried to try to find a way to get off the asteroid, which is now breaking up, and the situation is looking even worse. They come to a natural cave, which has been converted into a laboratory, where a man is lying on an operating table and various instruments are lying around.
Yeah, this part was really weird, too. Like, this operating room and everything, and the way everything is described, it feels kind of haphazard. Like, I picture it being a really dirty, like, nasty operating room. Not a clean scientific installation, that's for sure.
No, definitely a mine shaft in the middle of an asteroid is probably not the best place for a medical
Yeah. Yeah.
But there are the 7 vanished men, and their skulls have been shaven and marked with 3 red scars. In there is Lauren with a needle gun pointed at Furyk and tells him to have the ape drop Dana. They are all taken prisoner, and Jordan Andrews and his men are already there in the cage. And Dana notices the rounds are all anesthetic needles, not poison ones. The ape is ordered to attack, which distracts Lauren and gives Dana time to load his gun with poison needles. And he tells Lauren to drop his gun, the scientist to call off the ape, and now Dana has the upper hand. But another tremor is felt in the asteroid, and Furyk says that Andrews has opened his chemical tanks in the hope of trapping Furyk's men in the tunnels. A failure to shut off the flow of the chemicals had created mutations in the men, and Furyk was going to force Andrews to work for him. So Dana doesn't care about any of this. He just wants to get off this rock, and he's only taking Furyk because he's the only one worth anything. Lauren shouts out to him not to take Furyk back and asks him if he knows what the secret weapon is, and Lauren says that Venus can't have it, and Andrews yells that Earth can't have it. But Furyk says that Venus must have it, and all of a sudden he's safe behind the transmitter. And the ape leaps forward, and all parties draw their guns and start firing at one another as they're all jumping and diving for cover, and it's a real classic Western shootout.
Yeah.
The ape is just like wrecking various people in the background. And Furyk has now awakened the 7 sleepers who start firing needles at everyone. The sleepers being immune to these anesthetic needles, but Dana gets off a shot with his poison needles, which kills one, making him realize that poison works. So Lauren asks Dana to think about what this means for the solar system as he coolly takes down 3 more with poison bolts. And while undercover, some of the fire is relieved, but he looks around the laboratory and realizes that Furyk has been taking his men, performing weird operations on them, and turning them into an army that he can control for attack or defense.
Yeah. Basically zombies.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
So 2 more are coming for him, but the rumbling of the acid in the walls is quite audibly heard at this point, and the pressure causes the metal supports to buckle and snap, crushing the head of one of the assaulters like a melon, and Dana kicks the gun out of the hands of the other one and just like smashes him in the face. But this isn't enough to stop him, so he hits him in the head with a chair, and the impact reveals metal discs in his crushed skull, which must be linked to the radio transmitter. And there's like some kind of radio telepathic control device, which is better than robots.
Kind of remind me of that film movie, Creature with the Atom Brain.
I never saw that one.
Have you ever seen that? No.
No.
You've heard this? Have you heard the song Creature with the Atom Brain?
No, I also have not.
Neither of you a fan of Rocky Erickson?
I'm not too familiar.
Oh, okay. He used to be in the 13th floor elevators. It was like late 1960s Texas psychedelic band, and when he kind of started doing his own stuff, he did like really weird sci-fi and horror inspired songs. Creature with the Atom Brain and the Two-Headed Dog. Like, it's pretty cool. Nate, I'm surprised you haven't listened to Rocky Erickson, actually. But yeah, I was kind of reminded of Creature with the Atom Brain, which is about this like criminal guy who animated supposedly dead people.
Yeah, I've listened to 13.4 Elevators a couple times, but not a super lot. But these metal discs in the skull, they got to be related to this radio control somehow. So Dana throws a chair at Lauren's barricade, and this stuns him for a bit and allows Dana to get his gun. And as the ape charges Dana, Dana's able to get a clean shot at his throat, which kills it, and Dana makes off with Ferric. But at this time, the acid fumes are rushing in, and Dana has a moment of contemplation about Sark, Earth, Venus, the solar system, life, and death. So he just shoots Ferric, who falls dead, and helps Lauren and the rest of the survivors up. The asteroid is breaking up, and the man on the operating table is still there. He tells Lauren to make for Earth as he goes back alone to rescue him, and the walls buckle and collapse, leaving him trapped. And Dana laughs, saying, "I hope you're satisfied, Daddy. I hope the devil mixes brimstone with your Tequin."
Yeah.
By this time, Lauren and the rest will be off to safety, but he's doomed. And as he pushes the body off the operating table, he sees a volley of poison needles in the man that had already killed him long time ago, making him realize that this whole rescue attempt was totally useless. So Dana puts his gun to his head and pulls the trigger as the acid pours through the collapsing cave.
Yeah, it's quite a brutal waiting.
It is.
Yeah, when I was reading that, I was thinking of like the Western endings when it's like there is no hope for the protagonist, like a Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid type of situation.
Yeah, it's the real grim downer ending, and she does it so well.
Yeah, it's a really good ending.
Yeah, it is. And I love how cynical it is, because through the whole story, Dana doesn't care anything about himself but the bottom line. You know, he doesn't care about his Earth people. He doesn't care about this whole war. He doesn't care about the humanitarian consequences for the entire solar system, because presumably this is like a massively destructive war that is killing millions and millions of people.
Yeah. But in the end, he does care, though, because he cares for his people, and he doesn't want, like... And he doesn't want this thing to get out, because he knows it will make things so much worse for the human race. So I think he does have his redemption at the end.
Well, he does, but that's what I think makes it a cynical story, because the second he stops caring about anything but himself, and he starts caring for others and the fate of Earth and the solar system, that's what gets him killed.
That's true. So you think he could have gotten away earlier?
Yeah. If he would have just I don't care about any of this, I'm making off for myself, I'm going to shoot this guy and
that's true.
Take Lauren and the rest of the survivors off and, let's go, let's get out of here. He would have been fine. But no, he feels like he has to get everybody off. Now he wants to save everybody he can and, be a good guy. And it just instantly does not work out for him.
He's basically doing what he didn't accuse, but he advised Lauren to not be weak. And he's like, don't be like, the moment you let your guard down and you succumb to these sentimental feelings, you put your life at risk. And he's kind of trying to show that by example through the story, but then in the end he goes against that because, he kind of realizes how horrible this is. But it just gets him killed, right? So, in a way, his mentality probably kept him alive for a really long time.
Yeah, and I think that's a good quality in these gritty space westerns, is a good rogue character. And that's what Dana definitely is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's even like there's that ambiguity even in how he's described of he's always described as a wolf. I really like how that's kind of he has a wolfish face.
Yeah.
And it's even in how he looks, there's that moral grayness to him.
He definitely seems like he's going to be almost a villain at first. He seems, Dana, that is, he seems like he's going to be a problem. We don't have it necessarily, it's not clear reading the start that there's a protagonist figure, or there's somebody who's we're supposed to kind of focus on as the hero or anything like that. Because he's not, right? And we just kind of, I don't know, I was kind of reading this and thinking, Dana is the problem. He's unreasonable. He's unnecessarily harsh on his men. And he's being restrictive about the war and trying to cut people off from information that's probably important to them and stuff like that. And that's shitty. But at the same time, it's like, yeah, I can... Reading through it, and I kind of like started to feel, yeah, I see, this is what he needs to do to keep his little empire going.
Yeah, again, somebody who's always looking out for himself and what could personally come to him for his benefit. I mean, presumably, he can't pirate the whole system by himself, so he needs to bring in all the solar system's outlaws, but he's just very focused on his bottom line, and when the war is breaking out and all this destruction is happening, he cares about how it's affecting his profits, not how how people are probably dying these horrible deaths across.
I mean, that's what he says, but I guess what I'm getting at is I think he does really care for his men, and that's like, but for some reason, yeah, he has this attitude about him that's like, he's not able to admit that. Like, it would be a sign of weakness to kind of admit that maybe he does give a shit, at least about them, and he kind of feels like, yeah, this is our own thing we started, and I want us to keep it going, regardless of anything else. And, like, you, Venusians and Earthmen and Martians have to get along, because we're a special band, and we're space pirates, and we're not going to go home and be celebrated and venerated. And that's kind of another thing about this, is that, like, he's kind of talking about, like, how Lauren, for instance, like, he could save this secret for the Venusians, and he could take it back to them, and he could be a hero.
Right.
Like, he could be somebody who is appreciated by his own people. But at the same time, could he really? I mean, he's already broken the law. He's already proven himself to be an antisocial person, right? So, I don't know. Dana understands something that's kind of maybe vital to their survival. And it's kind of interesting how at the beginning I did see him that way. I did see him as somebody who was really selfish and who was like kind of unreasonable and shouting at his men and being a bastard because I'm the tough space guy and you can't fuck with me. But then by the end it was kind of like, you know what? I kind of get this guy. I think that he's more... Again, like, it's kind of the Blake 7 thing, right? Nate, you've watched the show, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and Gretchen, we've been watching it, and you know how Avon is, like, on the surface, he's so cold and self-directed and selfish and, like, but underneath there's something else kind of going on there where he won't admit that he's actually maybe not entirely like that. And
yeah, well, I think in Dana's case, it's kind of like his defense mechanism and how he survives tricky situations. He just kind of cuts out all empathy and humanity just so he can detach himself.
I think you'd have to have that to be an outlaw and to have the strength to build that empire that he has.
Yeah, and I mean, Avon is kind of a different character, even though they do have some similarities with one another. But, you know, Blake 7 is a good comparison point to this piece, as they both have very dark tones to them and a lot of morally gray characters. And I guess with Blake 7 there's more of a setup of protagonist and antagonist versus this, where it's just kind of a lot of people out for themselves and we don't really have heroes or villains here. And you know, Blake 7 is a little more complicated than something like a Star Wars or something like that, but again, it has that Western influence in it, where
big time.
It does have, you know, your ragtag band of outlaws who are on the run from the law and all that stuff.
But I mean, like, I guess I was making the parallel to Avon specifically because we don't always see that he cares for the people in his charge, right? But the things that he says and the thing that he does is not always, like, they don't always line up with each other. Sometimes it's like, he'll say something, and I kind of got this sense from Dana too, like the way he talks about weakness and stuff. But then he'll do something that's like, yeah, I do give a shit about this community, at least. And, I mean, in a way, it was like sad and desperate that he kind of thought it was worth starting this community in the first place, but maybe it is. All these guys are on the run, and they've done various things, either righteously or not, right? Like, some of them may be good people, and some of them may not.
Yeah, probably more so not than good, I would say.
Yeah.
Just, you know, based on how such a community would form.
I really liked the way she described what happened after the explosion. Like, after the explosion, it's like the turning point in this story where everything turns into this, like, toxic inferno for the rest of the story. And it's pretty intense, actually. And this is way more intense than any of the other stories this month. And I don't know if it's just because it's a later story, like we're talking 1941 now. But I don't think it's just that. I think it's her style and the fact that maybe Amazing was more welcoming to this kind of stuff at this time.
I mean, I think she's good at building up tension. And I mean, the asteroid breaking apart is one way of ramping that up. And then we get the whole chemical factory on top of that, which is another way of ramping up a little bit more. And some authors are good at doing that, regardless of if they're genre authors or not.
Oh, yeah.
I think she just has more natural talent in that than some of the other authors we've perhaps encountered during this episode.
I agree.
I really enjoyed this one, and I think this is a really great story, and I look forward to reading more of Leigh Brackett. I would definitely want to read more of her work.
Yeah, and I think we definitely will.
So the space opera anthology, the Space Opera Renaissance, where the Prince of Space is, it spans the supposed history of space opera from 1928, I think, till I'm not sure when it stops. In the 90s for sure. And it starts with 3 stories. It starts with Edmund Hamilton's story, The Star Stealers, and is followed by The Prince of Space by Williamson. And the 3rd story is Leigh Brackett's Enchantress of Venus. I would recommend that story. That's a really good one too. It's kind of weird. She doesn't seem to have been really recognized as much as she should be like now, but it seems like during her time, a lot of the science fiction writing community really respected her, and this is even like some of the later new wave people. Like, apparently she was really good friends with Michael Moorcock, and Moorcock kind of exemplifies that generation, at least on the surface. I mean, I think when you get down to it, a lot of Michael Moorcock's stories do have the old pulp sensibility. I honestly think that maybe his editorship of like New Worlds magazine and stuff was more weird and out there, and like he can certainly be pretty trippy in his writing and stuff, and definitely strange, but I do feel like it's pretty obvious that he read a lot of that old stuff and liked it. And as much as he might like to protest against people like Tolkien and like, you know, write his essay Epic Pooh, which is basically this awesome but ridiculous kind of takedown of J.R.R. Tolkien and Lord of the Rings and how much he doesn't like it. And like, it's kind of ridiculous to read. Like, a part of me kind of thinks he's saying, I'm bitter that Frodo Baggins is a household name, but Elric is not. Like, I can't help but kind of think that when I see somebody going to such lengths to take down a dead author.
Right.
But he and Brackett were friends, and the thing is, Brackett really defended this space western kind of storytelling. She was very vocal about kind of finding the subsequent generation that kind of repudiated that stuff and tried to turn away from it. She didn't necessarily find fault with what they did, but she sort of had to fight back against their dismissal of the space opera and the space western. And she was like, yeah, this is what we wrote, and this is what I felt, and I like this better than John Campbell's stuff. Like, that was what she said. She's like, that's why I didn't write for Astounding all the time, because I like the planet stories. I like the interplanetary romance. I had fun writing that stuff. And she was very firm about defending it, like right up until into the 70s. And I don't know, it's kind of interesting. She was a little bit of a pushback, but at the same time, like, people like Ray Bradbury found her very special, and people had really nice things to say about her in the following generations, even though maybe they protested against that kind of writing. But there does seem to be a lot of an interesting sort of back and forth in the science fiction community over what kind of stories to tell, and whether we want to be like admired in this kind of Western type of storytelling or move on to something else. And I think there's room for all of it. Like, that's one thing I've never really understood about criticism is, like, sometimes people say things like, well, it was the era of this, and so there was no room for this other thing. And I don't know, I always feel like there should be room for all of it. everybody has different tastes and different moods, and sometimes you want a space western, and you want to be in that, and you love it. And she was just so good at this kind of thing. You mentioned Empire Strikes Back earlier. I think it's worth talking about that just a little bit. Her script for Empire Strikes Back was not the script that was used. Some of the elements of it were in the film, like the planet Hoth, for instance, the ice planet. But that was only half or 3/4 of the way through her story. Her script for Empire Strikes Back is very different than the film we got. And I kind of like to imagine there was an alternate universe somewhere where that was the film that was made. And I'm not saying it would be better, necessarily. By the way, do we all think that Empire Strikes Back is the best of the Star Wars movies, or not?
I like the first three pretty much equally. I don't know.
I think I like it a little more than A New Hope. I would think so. It's sometimes hard. I sometimes go back and forth between which is my favorite.
Yeah, I think it's easily my favorite. I think it's the one Star Wars film that really feels like it actually has, like, the world around it comes to life, and it really feels like I can't wait for the next place they visit. I like the first movie. I think it's good. I like certain aspects of it. I like Peter Cushing as Grand Moff Tarkin, obviously.
Yeah.
And I like... But Empire Strikes Back is just... It's the one that feels really special. And at least some of that was Leigh Brackett. But again, it's really interesting to see how much of her story differs than what actually ended up on screen, because it was like a first draft script, and she died in 1978. So that script was prepared pretty soon after the first movie came out. Like, they were already thinking, okay, we're going to do a sequel.
Right.
Empire Strikes Back didn't come out till 80 or 81,
80, yeah,
I think.
right.
Yeah.
So it was like a couple years in the making, and she never got to work further on it, having died of cancer in 1978. But it's just pretty interesting. There's a video on YouTube. I don't know how much credence to give to it necessarily, but it's about how the creators think that she actually ghostwrote the original Star Wars film. And while I don't think the evidence for the ghostwriting is that strong from what I watched, but admittedly it wasn't the whole thing, because it was just like side-by-side comparisons, like, for the whole thing. But what I did like about it was that it included a lot of quotes from Brackett's stories. And what I really got from that was that George Lucas was probably very, very influenced by Leigh Brackett and Edmund Hamilton to create Star Wars.
Yeah,
but not necessarily that she worked on it herself, but that, like, there were so many parallels. And I don't know who created this. This is a really weird YouTube channel. I can't remember. I think it's called The Star Killer, which sounds like the name of an Edmund Hamilton story now that I think about it. But it's like basically only a few videos on the channel. And one of them is this: did Leigh Brackett ghostwrite Star Wars A New Hope? And they make so many parallels between their stories and between the film that it seems unavoidable to think like the influence must have been enormous, even if she didn't actually do any ghostwriting. But apparently she did work on a lot of uncredited screenplays, so I mean, I suppose it's possible, but I don't really see that as evidence, as anything more than influence, but like, it's a profound influence, nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear what the influences are that filter into the first Star Wars movie. And it's also very clear of the revisionism that Lucas puts into all of the stuff going forward, and how intensive that process was. I mean, even the titles of the film, you guys have been referring to it as A New Hope, but that wasn't part of the 1977 film.
Yeah.
That was something that came later. So, I mean, Lucas is definitely prone to change things a lot. And I haven't read Brackett's script for Empire Strikes Back. It apparently leaked online within the last 10 years or so.
Yeah, it is. It's worth a look. It's really different and interesting.
Yeah.
I will say right now, I'm not a big Star Wars fan. I like those movies, like the early movies. I'll watch them and enjoy them. I'm talking about the initial trilogy, of course. But I can't really say that I'm a Star Wars fan. But it has been with me since I was very young. Not as long as Doctor Who, perhaps, but I mean, it's there. And even though I wasn't a fan, I was aware of the stories early on, and I don't know, like, it's interesting enough for me to see, especially going back to this pulp stuff and seeing how clear it was that it was an influence. And now I can be a little bit cynical about Star Wars and be like, oh, people say that it changed science fiction, but it's really not new. It's like going back to the really old science fiction. Like, Star Wars was almost the reaction. Star Wars was like, oh, it's gone too far now. It's gone too far into weird territory. Let's bring it back to, like, the space westerns, and let's be happy about it, because we have a lot of money to spend to make it look good. So it almost feels like that. Like, it feels like a reaction. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe we needed more of the space westerns and more of the pulp type of sci-fi. Like, maybe the 60s and early 70s really did go too far for some people. I like a lot of those movies, and I'm sure we all do too. And, like, 2001 is awesome. Solaris is amazing, right? But sometimes, I guess, we want a story of rebels overcoming the evil empire, and that's always what Star Wars is. And psychic powers, and robots, and wisecracking droids. These are all things that Leigh Brackett and Edward Hamilton created back in the day.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, so more Brackett is in our future. Definitely.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. But I guess before we close out tonight, let's just see where Amazing progresses to the present day. So, under Ziff Davis, circulation does drop, and they changed the magazine format a few times, and we've mentioned the Shaver Mysteries a few times previously on the podcast.
Yeah.
I think this is one thing that really does hurt the magazine, as while initially popular, they had prevented the stories as a mixture of nonfiction and fiction, and this was really savaged pretty hard in Harper's for this, which caused them to kind of scale back on promoting the stories. But Ziff Davis sells the publication to Ultimate Publishing in 1965, and TSR, most known for Dungeons & Dragons, acquires it in 1982 and kills the magazine in 1995 after circulation numbers had been steadily declining for decades, going from about 30,000 in 1970 to less than 10,000 in 1992.
Amazing.
In the 2000s and into the present era, a number of people have tried to revive it, and the current incarnation of Amazing Stories launched out of a Kickstarter campaign in 2018 by Steve Davidson. So today, it's still putting out print issues. We're not sure for how long, but it's neat to see that the legacy still continues, though obviously in radically different forms from when Hugo Gernsback was running it in 1926.
Wow. All right. Well, I'm sure we will be mentioning Amazing one or two times in the future, if not more. But we'll also be talking about a lot more of the American pulps from the 30s onwards. So this has been a really interesting trip, guys. I really enjoyed this excursion.
Yeah, likewise.
I hope you guys did too.
Yeah, good set of stories and very historically significant.
Mm-hmm. Yes, even at the times when the stories themselves weren't that great, it was still interesting to learn about the authors behind them and put them into the context of when they were written. Yeah,
fortunately, we did not decide to read any of the 175,000 word novels that got published in the annuals or the quarterlies, which might have made this a little bit more of a slog, but I think in general, all the stories, even if Out of the Void was a bit slow in places, I think it was overall rewarding and worth reading.
I was certainly interested in everything. I mean, Out of the Void was not good, but I don't have any regrets.
No.
I don't have any regrets.
No, not at all.
Sometimes I see things like, I really regretted reading this book and I want my time back and all this stuff. Like, I don't really feel that. Like, I'm not necessarily thinking that I'm going to finish the Out of the Void sequel, but at the same time, yeah, it's fine. And everything else was pretty good, actually, in its own way. I personally, I don't know if I can really talk too highly of Minna, just because of the way the story panned out. But at the same time, even that, it's like the style was so good. You know what? Yeah, read that. It's cool. Williamson I had a lot of fun with, and I really enjoyed getting into his background. I know I talked about that for a long time, but I think it was kind of worth it. And Brackett is amazing. So, yeah, she's really good. I want to come back to Brackett just because she's such a cool writer. And we're going to be doing a lot of things in the future of the podcast, and one of the things that I want to announce right now is that starting next month, we will be doing something called the Host Choice, which is essentially an episode where one of us gets to pick what it is we're going to read based on whatever the hell we want. Could be a theme, could be not a theme, could be just, hey, we like these stories. So I'm thinking that next month, in November, we're actually going to have a host choice episode. And so now, I'd like us to take the opportunity to talk about our potential host choices and then roll for who gets to be the host of the host choice. So, we've all picked something that we're going to talk about in the next episode. I guess we'll go Nate first, then Gretchen, then me. And I have a die here. It's a d6, and I will roll when we get to the end, and we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So, Nate, why don't you start? What's your choice for next month?
Sure. So I think I have chosen, like probably we all have, some later works, as this is kind of be our opportunity to maybe break from a chronological format and incorporate some more modern stuff now that we've really laid this groundwork with the amazing episode. So I've chosen 2 shorter works to cover, I think, which will both be interesting topics of conversation. One being the epic poem Aniara by Swedish Nobel laureate Harry Martinson, as well as the short story A Night of 21 Hours by Renato Pestrianero, or perhaps better known as the short story which inspired the Mario Bava film Planet of the Vampires.
Great film.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yes, I recently watched it with Jam, and that was a really good film. I would like to read that, so
Awesome.
I'm looking forward to that. For my choice, I'm going with, unlike your choices, I've actually read the book that I am putting forward, which is Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. And it's been a while since I've read it, so I thought it would be fun to revisit it for the podcast. I've read a couple of things by Butler at this point, including her parable duology and her collection of short stories, Bloodchild. But I think Kindred is still my favorite among the things I've read by her. So that is what I've decided to go with.
It's definitely one I've been hearing that's been great for a really long time, so I would really like to read that one.
Yeah, and that takes us well into the 1970s, so That'll be a first on the podcast for sure.
Yeah, 79.
Yeah, I really want to read that as well. I'm looking forward to getting to that. And we'll decide what to do with the other choices after, like, whatever we pick this time. I guess we should really honor the other host choices, and I'm thinking maybe we'll do this every 3 months or something like that.
Yeah, I think we're going to integrate more of the modern content into the podcast going forward, and this will give us an opportunity to bring in some of our favorite or more interesting picks, because as we get forward in time, there's going to be thousands and thousands and many, many more stories that are published in any given year, so a chronological approach at some point as we're going forward isn't going to necessarily be the best way of going forward, as a lot of these tropes and genre conventions are pretty much established during this time when Amazing is in its heyday. And, we're going to get around to the Golden Age and Astounding and all that stuff later. But I mean, a lot of the formulas have been written by this point, and we're just seeing kind of variations on that. So we want to bring out the best of those variations, not necessarily every story ever published.
Exactly. And I don't think we've necessarily been sticking too close to chronology, especially recently, but like it kind of does seem, I suppose, if you kind of listen to what we do, it kind of seems a little bit haphazard in terms of like how we're trying to incorporate the themes and stuff, but I think it's kind of inevitable. I mean, we do have a little bit of a method to our madness, I think, in that we don't necessarily go chronologically, especially now, but we actually do try to fit everything together in a way. And so far, I think we've done a pretty good job of actually referring to a lot of what's come before, like even in episodes where you wouldn't expect. Where it's like, yeah, we can call back to Frankenstein. We can call back to Angel of the Revolution. We can call back to the Time Machine. It's all here, and it's all part of this skein of history that's been developed around us. But now, my choice, so I've talked about Jack Vance on the podcast a little bit before, and how much of a fan I am of his writing, and how I think he's really one of the best kind of, I guess, social science fiction writers and also like fantasy writers who really takes you into a world and really delves into the society and how the world functions and what it's like to live there, and sometimes with very strange results, but he always makes it convincing. And he always makes it convincing in a relatively small amount of pages. So what I've actually chosen for my host choice is Imperio by Jack Vance. And this is a book that I have not read yet, but I'm quite familiar with Vance, having read a good number of his books and stories in the past. And this one is one I've been saving for a while. It's considered a really good work by him, by a number of people, and made the science fiction masterwork. It's a series of, I don't know, there's probably about 60 or 70 books on it, and it's like published by Gollancz, I think, and they do these editions of basically what they consider to be essential works of science fiction, and a lot of it is kind of not necessarily what you would expect. They pull out some interesting picks. It seems to be a lot of it sort of geared towards literary value and merit. And I don't know, I think Vance has got a really special voice, and his style is just really amazing for me, and it really pulls me in immediately. And I think, Nate, you haven't read any Vance before?
No.
Okay, and Gretchen, you've just read Bad Ronald, right?
Yes, very different from most of the other things he's written, so I'm looking forward to reading something that's more in his realm of science fiction and fantasy.
Yeah, cool. All right, well, I've chosen that, and I've also chosen, because Imperio is quite short, it would have been considered a novel, and was certainly published as such, but the definition of a novel has expanded over time in a way. We see a lot more 1,000-page doorstoppers than we used to, and the definition of a novella has also changed to incorporate a 180, 170-page novel or something. And so Imperio might be considered a novella. And so I decided to add something to it, and that was a completely unrelated short story, Vintage Season by C.L. Moore and Henry Cuthler. It's most often attributed mostly to C.L. Moore, but as we will discuss if we talk about this, which we will at some point, they were pretty much a writing partnership. And it's hard to know exactly how much one influenced the other, but it's pretty clear that they both influenced each other a lot. The Vintage Season is most often attributed to Moore, and it can be found in the Best of C.L. Moore anthology. Whether Kuttner had a hand in it or not, we don't know, but it was published under a pseudonym. I believe it was Lawrence O'Donnell this time. And it's a really good story from 1943, I believe, or maybe 41, sometime in the early 40s anyway. And it's just an amazing, really cool, unpredictable story about nothing that you would expect. And just, I don't want to spoil it. Gretchen, I know that you know the story. Nate, I think it's new to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't want to spoil it. It's a really good story. I like it a lot. I think you guys will too. I'm looking forward to potentially talking about it. So those are my choices. And now I have my 60 here, rolling it around in my hand. So, Nate, if it lands on 1 or 2, we'll have one of your picks. Gretchen, 3 or 4, and me, 5 or 6. And now I'm going to throw the die. Okay, what is our choice? 4. So, that means we're doing Kindred, guys.
That means we're also getting another Dana. The main character's name is Dana.
Maybe we should start a Dana count to compare with the Clara count of the early episodes and see who wins.
Yeah.
All right, cool.
All right. Yeah. Okay, so next one, we'll be bringing you Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. For now, though, I think it's time to say goodnight. I want to tell you all to keep your toxic refineries off my asteroid. And also, make sure that your positive ray tubes are not aimed in my direction, because I don't like positive rays. This is Chrononauts, and we have been amazing this month.